I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And welcome back to Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. We are continuing our Sherlock Holmes theme month.
Mm-hmm.
And this week we did the 1976 The 7% Solution.
Indeed.
And this was one of Nate's selections.
This was one of my selections. It's been a long time, and I really enjoyed revisiting this movie.
Yeah.
Now, you knew basically nothing about it.
So I debated whether or not I would look into this, but I tend to prefer on most of Nate's selections to come in blind and just come into it without any preconceived notions, nothing, and just see how it goes and see how it hits me. I did enjoy this, though it is a little dated.
Yeah, and I'm sure
it's still
we'll
enjoyable.
Get into that. Yeah. So this is a film that I have seen before tonight only one time.
Okay, really?
Yeah, in 2007. VHS copy from the Boise Public Library. And I remember the weekend that I watched it, because I had recently moved out of my parents' home, but they were gone for the weekend, so I went back to the house to enjoy cable and other things.
Yeah.
And I watched this movie, and I just remember really, really liking it.
Was it on cable, or did they...
No, I rented it from the public library.
And watched it even though you went back to their house to watch
Even though I went back
cable?
to the house, yeah.
That's funny.
So I just... Again, it's been, 2007. So I'd forgotten a good amount of what was in the movie. But I remembered...
Well, it's an extremely active film. It would be hard to remember all of it in one shot.
I just chiefly remembered how impressed I was by it. And I had long wanted to see it again, but it is not a very accessible film. I ultimately had to track down and order a DVD copy of this because I just can't find it anywhere else. And it's not even available to rent on Prime. And most films of any report are available to rent on Prime. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting how obscure this film has become, because I think it's quite good. So the 7% Solution I have often described to people, and this kind of simplifies it, but this gets at the heart of it, as Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud solve a mystery. Now, there's more to it than that, but the whole conceit of it, to bring the fictional character Sherlock Holmes and the historic character Sigmund Freud, two brilliant minds, and team them up, I just think is a wonderful idea, and I think it's quite well executed here. This is based on a novel, which I would be genuinely interested in reading, because I'd like to kind of see this story fleshed out the way you could in a novel. But we're going to talk first a little bit about...
Real quick, if I understood correctly, this is non-canonical novel, right?
It's not a Arthur Conan Doyle.
Okay.
And I'll get into the writer of it. So I want to talk just very briefly about the director and then the writer, and then I think we'll touch on the plot at least, and then the cast is so spectacular that I want to definitely spend some time talking about the cast.
Yeah.
So 7% Solution, 1976 release. It is directed by a man named Herbert Ross, who was, he might even still be alive, was definitely a working director. He is probably best known for some of the films he did in the 80s,
like
principally
Steel Magnolias.
Footloose and Steel Magnolias. Yeah.
He passed away in 2001.
Oh, 2001, okay.
Yeah.
But this film is adapted, a screenplay adapted by Nicholas Meyer from his novel, 1974 novel, The 7% Solution. Now, Nicholas Meyer is a great screenwriter, and he has done a lot of things, and a lot of things that I've liked. He was a writer on Star Trek's 2, 4, and 6. Now, if you know much about the Star Trek franchise, there's the ongoing joke that every other Star Trek film is the good one. And he was a writer on all of the good ones. He also wrote some TV movies. Before this, his principal credit was a early mid-70s TV movie called, if I remember correctly, The Day That Panicked America, about the Orson Welles' War of the World, broadcast in 1938.
Yeah.
I have actually seen this TV movie, and I hadn't realized that he was a writer on it. I chiefly remember that Tom Bosley from Happy Days was in it.
Nice.
He also wrote Time After Time, which is a great time travel movie. He has a definite interest in the Victorian era. That's a personal... It's a film I'm quite fond of. And then he wrote, or was a writer on The Day After, which was a television event in 1983, a telefilm about a nuclear war.
Wow.
And this screenplay and the book that it was based on, The 7% Solution, from 1974, was the start of a series of Sherlock Holmes books that Nicholas Meyer wrote, including The West End Terror in 1976, The Canary Trainer in 1993, and most recently, The Adventures of the Peculiar Protocols, 2019.
Wow.
So he's still writing these things.
Yeah.
And he certainly has a great command of the source material, and he comes at this with a little bit of a kind of a quirky eye, and he kind of reinvents a number of things and explains things. The setting, the introduction to the film mentions that it's 1891, and this is just before the 4-year absence where Holmes is missing and presumed dead, reportedly at the hands of Professor Moriarty. And this film kind of explains the alternate version of what really happened and why it ended up being attributed to Moriarty, who in this telling is not the Napoleon of crime. He is not this genius rival Sherlock Holmes, but he is a person important to the psychology of Sherlock Holmes, which is explored by Sigmund Freud. Watson and Mycroft basically have to trick Holmes, who's starting to get his cocaine addictions getting to really affect his brain, and they're concerned
It's just
about his
getting
health.
out of control.
Yeah, he's become unhinged. So and he's become obsessed with Professor Moriarty, so they create a false lead to trick him to go to Europe so that Sigmund Freud, who at this point in his career, at least in the film, is a specialist in addiction, or has recently had a lot of success with getting people to detox. And so they lure him there for that purpose, and then they kind of stumble upon a crime, and it's just kind of a joy to see these two characters interact. And one of the things it does towards the end is basically imply that Dr. Freud's psychology was inspired by the logic of Sherlock Holmes, and he decided to use those techniques to explore the human mind.
Though they do imply that one of his most core and controversial opinions
That's
has already
true.
come
Had
to be.
already come out. That's true.
Yeah, but it's implied that then, having learned from Sherlock Holmes his, deduction and whatnot, that he then uses that to flesh
imply
that out
that,
and forward his theories.
So you mentioned that you liked it.
Yeah.
What are some thoughts you had about it?
The casting, well, we'll get into casting in a minute. It's just it seems like a well-developed story. There are a few instances where it's so active that there's a few errors and things like that. But it's fairly, for the most part, it's fairly well developed, and I was surprised how active it was.
Yeah.
How many different action sequences occur within the movie.
Yeah.
And its tempo is good. It actually builds and crescendos and decrescendos throughout the film repeatedly. It does a great job with its tempo.
It takes a little while to get going at first. I don't think the film really kind of gets into its own until Freud enters. So yeah, the first 20-25 minutes is principally in London and working their way to Vienna, which is okay. But I think the magic comes in.
I didn't really
Freud
care for
comes in.
Mycroft there at the beginning either.
Mycroft, that was
He's
an
only
interesting
briefly
portrayal.
in it, but he's ancient.
Yeah, he is pretty ancient.
Yeah.
He looks a little bit like Chester A. Arthur.
I don't know that I've seen very many films with a young Robert Duval. So it took me a minute and same thing with Alan Arkin. It took me some time to recognize those two.
Yeah.
And figure out who they were, because I hadn't even looked. I knew who Robert Duvall was right away, but Alan Arkin, I knew he was in it, but I was like, wait a minute, like which one is
Yeah, so we probably need to get to the cast.
Yeah.
So great cast. Interestingly, Nicol Williamson, who plays Holmes, is fourth billed.
Yeah.
And to have a Holmes film where Holmes is fourth billed is kind of interesting, but you understand why when you see who else is in the cast. So we have Alan Arkin as Dr. Sigmund Freud. He does, both him and Vanesa Redgrave, who's second billed as Lola Devereaux, do a good job with the accents. I like that everybody here is doing an appropriate accent.
The accents are a little bit heavy throughout the film.
Yeah, but they're all trying, and I appreciated that. Robert Duvall's accent was okay.
Yeah.
Robert Duvall is one of the more interesting casting decisions here, to have this very American actor play Watson. Interesting choice. What did you think of that choice?
Well, I enjoy Robert Duvall, and so I didn't think of it from that perspective. I just let myself, movies to a certain extent require the suspension of belief. And if you go into a movie and bite on quick enough and accept Robert Duvall as Holmes, or sorry, as Watson, then I think it was fine.
Yeah, he was fine. He wasn't super strong. I like certain
He had
things.
some funny lines.
I liked how physical he was.
Yeah.
This was a Watson that was just kind of raring for a fight, and the scene where he has to knock out Holmes in order to subdue him, I thought was just kind of awesome. Vanesa Redgrave, of course, is very good in this. She's quite beautiful. This is kind of at the... I guess she would have been about 39 or so when she made this. She's quite good. For some reason, my brain kept thinking that if they were to remake this today, that part would be played by Saoirse Ronan.
Quite possibly, yeah.
Who obviously would be younger, but it's a part where the age for that character is not super important.
Yeah.
Nicol Williamson as Holmes, what did you think of him?
He was okay, but Holmes doesn't need to be the strongest character in this film. But yeah, I mean, it was acceptable. I mean, again, we're a spoiler-heavy podcast, but he's unconscious through a significant portion of the film. So to a certain extent, he's somewhat a body double, till late in the movie. Once it gets going, he does pretty good. He delivers his lines reasonably well. Has some funny lines as Watts or as Holmes.
So a couple things about Williamson. So he was a working British actor. He had a decades-long career. He's not particularly known this side of the pond. But when I think of him, I think of two roles principally, which are possibly even the only two roles that I can think of that I've seen him in. So there's this, and then he is in a film called The Human Factor from 1979, which was the last film directed by Otto Preminger, one of my favorites. Otto Preminger's career kind of peaked in the late 50s, early 60s, and then there was a period in which the quality was kind of steadily working its way down. And then for the last film, and not everybody thinks this, but I think it poked up quite a bit. The Human Factor is based on a Graham Greene novel that came out like a year or so before. That film came out in 79, which is about a British intelligence officer who is turned by the Russians. And it asks the question, how does a patriotic man with no interest in communism, no desire to betray his country, how does he end up betraying his country? And the story that film presents is like, I totally get why he did it. It's like, I don't necessarily approve of it, but I get why he did what he did. And it's a great film. It's one that I would not be opposed to doing an episode on at some point in the future.
I have a feeling we're going to at some point do another one of his films, which is he plays Little John in Robin and Marian.
Ah, yes, the
1976, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So I thought he was quite good in this. There's a comment that had been made by a film critic about this performance and about its legacy in terms of the way that Holmes is portrayed on film. So Mike Hale of the New York Times wrote a piece in which he mentioned that Robert Downey Jr.'s version of Sherlock Holmes, Benedict Cumberbatch's in Sherlock, and Johnny Lee Miller's in Elementary, that they all kind of grew out of Nicol Williamson's performance, that he was kind of the father of all these modern Holmeses, saying the film established the template for all the twitchy, paranoid, vulnerable, strung-out Holmeses to come. That seems right to me. Because the Holmes before here, with some exceptions, and one of those exceptions we'll talk about next week, were much more the Basil Rathbone, almost superhuman Holmes, whereas this Holmes, and a lot of the subsequent ones, put more emphasis on his humanity and his flaws and how complicated a character he is. And I'm so removed from the original stories and novels that I've read, which weren't very many, that I'm not sure which is truer off the top of my head. If the Conan Doyle ones, if he was more vulnerable,
it
or
actually
if...
strikes a balance. I mean, he's got his flaws in either version, though this version tends, and from what I've gathered about these novels, this series tends to exploit his flaws more than the Arthur Conan Doyle's. But the flaws still easily exist within, they do exist.
But this is also one of those cases where you talk about any kind of mythic character, kind of iconic literary character like Holmes, that he can be adapted for the time in which the presentation is made. And so it makes sense that in a time more interested in internal psychology and personal flaws like the 1970s on, compared to before the 1970s, it makes sense that it would go in this direction.
Yeah.
And he's an interesting enough character with enough variables to explore that I think it works. Other important cast members here.
Laurence Olivier.
Laurence Olivier, very briefly, as Dr. Moriarty, which they have an interesting take on. Joel Grey plays Lowenstein. That's the kind of sniveling guy that's the servant of the conspirators.
Yeah.
Joel Grey is an Oscar winner.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, he won an Oscar in the early 70s for Cabaret. He's a song and dance man. Didn't have a huge career after that. I think he was always mostly a stage actor, but you are more familiar with his daughter, Jennifer Grey, of Flashdance and Ferris Bueller fame.
Yep.
You got Samantha Egger, who's still with us as Mrs.
Mary Watson.
Mrs. Watson. Jeremy Kemp
Plays
as
Baron Leinsdorf.
Charles Gray plays Mycroft Holmes. Charles Gray we know as one of our Blowfields.
Yep.
And he was also the bad guy in The Devil Rides Out, which we did for Halloween a couple years before the podcast. It's just a real solid cast. It's a very well cast film.
I mean, on our principal cast, they interact fairly well. Alan Arkin, Robert Duval, and Nicol Williamson. Their interactions on the screen are great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They've got a good kind of easy flow going between them.
What did you think of Toby?
Toby was kind of fun.
They completely lose him late. Well, not completely.
Kind of disappears.
He appears at the very end. But for as prominent as he was at the beginning of the film, he pretty well just disappears.
What do you think of when you think of Toby?
He's a bloodhound. I love bloodhounds.
But do you have a version of Toby that comes out in your mind? Because I definitely do.
No.
The Great Mouse Detective.
Oh, okay.
In 1986. He's a fairly mid-level part of that film. I mean, they ride him around.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that's what I think of when I think of Toby. I don't know if I've ever read one of the Holmes stories in which that character appears.
Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head either. I don't think so.
So there's you mentioned there's a lot of good action sequences in this, a lot of movement. One that comes to mind is the tennis. I guess it's tennis. It's an indoor tennis racquetball.
It's a weird mixture
hybrid
of tennis
badminton
and,
something.
Exactly. I don't know what that's called.
That Freud and the Baron have an altercation at a gentleman's club, and they decide to settle it by this tennis game.
Yeah.
It's a fun scene.
It's a fun scene, almost entirely pointless. They could have just,
yeah, that's true.
It could have been cut.
Well, they're there to introduce the fact that the Baron exists.
Yeah. Well, but, it could have been more concise, but it was fun.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying it's a bad part of the movie or anything, but in the context of the film, it's largely pointless. After the locker room, you know who the Baron is. Yeah. So,
what did you think of so Joel Grey leads them, they're following Joel Grey around, and he takes them into a library. That library is freaking awesome.
Yeah.
And then he lures them into the horse arena.
Yeah.
Where 6 white horses attempt to stampede our heroes to death.
Yeah.
Which is kind of unique, it's clever, it's creative, it's something different visually.
Well, and at the point at which it comes in, I think you made a comment about it when it was occurring too. It's a reference to the rampages of cocaine.
Yeah, because they're 6 white horses. That was good, but the chief action sequence in this film is the train chase. Now, one of the interesting things about this film is it kind of shifts the type of film it is throughout. So the first 20 or so minutes is more conventional Sherlock Holmes, a little bit boring, I thought.
It's almost like 3 different films.
Yeah. So you've got that, and then you've got Holmes is in Vienna and his dealing with his rehab situation where you have the hallucination sequences, which work pretty good. They're very 70s visual techniques, but that's pretty good. And it isn't until about halfway through the film that we get to the mystery proper that involves
Miss
Devereaux, who was a patient of Freud's, who was a singer, very famous French singer, who had a cocaine addiction, and Freud helped her get over that. But she has relapsed, and Holmes deduces that it was a forced relapse, that somebody was injecting her, and that there's something fishy going on, and somebody's trying to abduct her, and that's the principal motivating factor of the last half of the film. She is abducted by the Baron to sell to the Prime Minister of the Ottoman Empire, who shows up briefly half an hour plus earlier in the film. and they have this private train, and Holmes and his party get there a little late, and they try to rent another train, private train to catch up and save her, but there's simply not enough time to arrange this, so they decide it would be easier to hijack a train and chase after our abductee. And it proves to be a really fun sequence. It's a long sequence. It has a great energy to it. It is the third film of the 3 or so films that compose this movie. It's humorous. I really like the poor train guy, the conductor that they basically...
The conductor who they kidnap, who then is a willing accomplice.
Yeah, as soon as he figures out what's going on, he is all in.
Yeah.
And he's...
Let me help with that.
Let me help with that. And it's like, we're running out of fuel. What can we do? So, we can take apart... Holmes comes up with, we can take apart the one car, the caboose. And at first the guy's like, no. Then he's like, well, yeah, but don't forget the roof. And we can do this. We can do this more efficiently.
And then let me come help you.
And then he gets hurt.
He gets shot.
He gets shot.
A flesh wound.
And he doesn't know these people from Adam. And he possibly has flushed his career down the toilet for this.
No, he was kidnapped.
He was hijacked. That's true. But I really love that character. It's a minor character, but it's fun.
Yeah, that sequence is fun and also a little odd. Holmes has a firearm, he has a pistol, and yet he proceeds to have a saber battle.
They have a saber battle because the Duke's like, "Oh, you have a pistol? Well, I bet you can't fight me with a saber."
With sabers.
And so they start to have this saber battle that goes on and on and on. And then eventually the train... So Holmes has been able to get himself from their pursuing train onto the bad guy's train. And he confronts the Baron. They eventually start to have this saber battle. And the train goes under into a tunnel. Everything gets dark. And then the next scene...
They're climbing
out the windows onto the top of the train. How did they get out there in the dark? I don't care. I loved it.
Which sets up the continued saber battle on the roof of the train. Predictably, they come to another bridge or overpass or whatever, and so Holmes has his back to the bridge and has to duck at the last minute, which gives the Baron the chance to regain his footing. And it's a prolonged saber battle. It's fun. Of course, the hero always wins. So eventually, Holmes runs the Baron through, and then they're able to go and save Miss Devereaux.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they have the little coda at the end where...
Actually, it's Freud that saves Miss Devereaux.
Yeah. So they have this coda at the end because they've been hinting with these little flashes of a young Sherlock Holmes ascending a stairwell. And Freud is obsessed with... There's got to be something in his past psychologically that would cause somebody that brilliant to do something as stupid as use cocaine.
Well, not just that, but the fixation on Moriarty.
And the fixation on Moriarty... And it ends up also explaining his issues with women and why he became a detective, because we find out when he was a little boy, his mother was having an affair with his math teacher, his math tutor, Professor Moriarty. His father caught them in the act, murdered his mother, and then Moriarty escaped. Is an interesting...
And both Sherlock and Mycroft are both aware of it.
Well, Mycroft is definitely consciously aware of it, but the implication is that Holmes has basically suppressed this. So he's not consciously aware that this happened. But when Watson goes to Mycroft for assistance, Mycroft seems to, he doesn't say it, but you can tell he knows what. It's like he's obsessed with Moriarty. It's like he knows exactly what that's about.
Yeah. Well, and he goes to Moriarty and is like, "You're going to help us." And he's like,
well
why should I do this? Well, because of this thing from our childhood. Oh, okay. Well, then I'll do it. Yeah.
Yes, I have no particular desire to dredge up the past, but I am more than capable of doing it. Okay. I'll do whatever you need. I don't want my career destroyed.
What about the conclusion of this film? How did you like that?
The little topper at the end on the boat. I liked it.
Yeah, it was,
the
it
implication is that Miss Devereaux and
Sherlock Holmes
are going to have a prolonged affair of approximately 3 or 4 years that will explain why he was disappeared. He took an alias as a violinist.
It also explains the entire rumor of that he's been killed.
Yeah. And in fact, Holmes, when he's departing from Watson's like, "What do I tell our readers?" He's like, "Oh, tell them anything. Tell them I was murdered by my math tutor.
By my mathematics tutor.
They won't believe you anyway."
Yeah, it was a fun film. How would you rate this film?
I quite like this film. When the first 20-25 minutes, I'm like, I don't know if this is feeling as good as when I remembered it. But after Freud comes in, he introduces the magic to the film. I would give this movie 3.5 stars, and probably 8.
Would
8
you?
stars on the 10-star scale.
I'd probably only give this 2.5 stars on the 4-star scale. I could be talked into 3. Again, it's a little bit dated. And on the 10-star scale, I would probably give this a 7. How do you think this fares amongst others?
In terms of
Like an aggregate score on IMDb?
I don't know. I think mostly positive. It was pretty well reviewed when it came out. It was number 9 on Gene Siskel's top 10 of the year that year. And he said it was the most elegant film of the year, and that it was this rare combination of kind of action and intelligence, which it is.
It has an IMDb aggregate score of 6.7 stars. And also, interestingly enough, it was nominated for 2 Oscars.
Oh.
Any guesses as to what that might be?
The script?
Best screenplay based on material from another medium.
And then something about production design.
Costume design. Speaking of which, Nate wants Watson's suit from this movie.
Watson's freaking awesome suit.
Yeah. I'm going to have to get on Wish and see if I can find something like this or order it. Yeah.
Yes, this awesome kind of, it's almost like a magic eye checker effect that it has.
Yeah.
The only garment in this film to compare would be that crazy outfit the Baron's wearing, that sports coat is wearing at the end.
Yeah.
That's insane. It's very colorful.
Yeah, it's a fun film, though. It's still a plenty enjoyable film today. 1976, so it's 44 years old now?
Yeah.
But it's still a film that can easily be enjoyed today. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I got to revisit it, and I'm glad that I own it now. And I'm looking forward. I'll probably watch it again in the next few months.
I'm not surprised by that. Anything else to say on this one?
No.
Okay. Well, I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And this has been Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. And we're going to be back momentarily with a soda tasting. So this is kind of a continuation of just something fun that we do on the podcast. There's no sponsor here, but there's a local store here called the Root Beer Store. As the name would suggest, they sell all sorts of root beers, and they sell a number of other novelty sodas.
Yes.
So tonight, we're going to be trying from the brand Hank's, which Hank's is a wonderful brand. I've loved everything I've tried from Hank's. Their vanilla cream is amazing. Their root beer is great. Their diet root beer is great. Really?
No, I don't think so.
You should definitely try Hank's.
I kind of like this bottle.
Yeah?
It's got the label.
Yeah.
And then a little above it on the neck is another version of the label, kind of smaller. But
it's embossed in the glass.
Yeah, embossed. It feels cool.
Yeah.
Not just physically cool.
But Hank's their brand is great. Like I've tried 4 or 5 different flavors from Hank's, and I've loved every single one. However, I'm skeptical of the flavor we're trying tonight.
Indeed. I'm not a big pumpkin spice guy.
Aren't you?
No.
I guess you could call me a basic white chick. I like pumpkin spice.
I'm not anti-pumpkin spice, but I don't seek out pumpkin spice.
How do you make a pumpkin spice soda?
Oh,
We're about to find out, I suppose.
Indeed.
Because we are going to be trying Hank's seasonal pumpkin spice soda. So, that's a deep color.
It is. I'm good. It smells pumpkin spicy, almost cinnamon-y.
Cumin, definitely cumin in it. It's more subtle than I expected.
Yeah. It's not, like, physically warm, but it feels warm is probably the descriptor I'd use for it. It's like it's very chilly outside kind of drink.
Yeah.
Which I guess pumpkin is.
I mean, you can get the flavor of the pumpkin, but definitely like the cumin or whatever is much stronger.
Yeah. It's an interesting taste.
Yeah. It's definitely not the worst soda I've ever drank. I would say it is far preferable to Moxie.
Yeah.
And we should note that the owners of the Root Beer Store, we've told them that we've done this on the podcast, and the only comments that we've really received is, why don't you guys try some of our good sodas? Which we've done one good soda on the podcast. But we've mostly done odd flavors.
This is kind of intriguing. I think I would probably have this again, especially when it gets cooler.
Yeah. Later in October.
Yeah.
This is being recorded in September, but
because I can see the appeal to it. And
yeah, it's intriguing.
It's comforting.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe this would be good around Thanksgiving. Hank's Pumpkin Spice Soda.
Pretty good.
I definitely think I'll be trying it again. But yes, Hank's makes a beautiful bottle.
They do.
Yeah. And they have good caps, too.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that's that.
It's the testing of levels, wherein levels are tested for the purposes of testing the levels.
Can you do that again?
I don't know if I can do that again. I don't think I can. I think that's a one-off.
That was awesome, though. Come on.
It's the testing of levels, wherein levels are tested for the purposes of testing the levels.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
That's gonna, yeah. Yeah. All right. I think, let's see. Turn that down just a scotch.
Just a tad. Just an itty bits.
Just a scotch.
A scotch.
Yes.
Which is a unit of measurement. Apparently.
Actually, it is.
It is?
Yes. And
Shakespearean?
I don't know, but I have a book. I'm trying to remember what it's called, the Pocket Reference Book. I'm not kidding you. It's, like that, but it's like that thick.
Indeed.
And in it it's all like conversions for measurements and different things, and like information about noble gases, things of that nature, welding references. But in it has measurements and conversions, and scotch is one of the things that's in it. But I don't recall what.
I believe it's usually used in the theater. The stage scotch.
Wow. That belongs on a list of dad jokes.
Indeed.
Okay, we about ready?
Yes.
You're doing that just to mess with my ears when I edit, aren't you?
Perhaps.
Yeah.